Thank you for watching the Housing Oregon YouTube channel. Be sure to join our network and get involved in the work that we are doing. If you can, please like and subscribe. It helps us build this channel, which serves as a platform to communicate with our members. This video is part of our 2025 annual conference. We're looking for folks to be on the conference planning committee. Please email info@housingoregon.org.
Well, thank you for coming to this workshop on community investment. My name is Catherine Petrus. I'm the Director of Institutional Accountability with the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. And that basically means I work with banks and with bank data. And more on both of those during the workshop. A little bit about NCRC. We are a coalition of over 700 nonprofit organizations. We're based in Washington, D.C. I'm based in Durham, North Carolina. And NCRC and all of our members have a common economic justice mission. We have a wide range of programs, and the one I wanted to highlight for you today is called the National Training Academy. They have traditionally provided HUD certified housing counseling training, but they're really expanding their offerings and they're developing a community investment institute. So everything I touch on today is going to be part of that community investment certification that we're developing. So it will have much, much more detail and in-depth trainings on all the topics I'll touch on today. So if you're interested, I do have cards here, and if you're interested in learning more about that and seeing that develop, please feel free to take a card and stay in touch. So today's agenda will cover a brief history of redlining and the Community Reinvestment Act, an overview of the current Community Reinvestment Act rules and regulations, which were implemented in 1995. I'll talk about how NCRC utilizes CRA for advocacy to increase access to capital for communities, and then share some closing thoughts and action steps. A couple of housekeeping items. We have a mic up here, and I would love questions as I go along. Don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask a question. You don't have to hold questions till the end of the session. The slides have a lot of information. I like to use these workshops as an opportunity to share information with you all. So the slides will be available, and I'll be available afterwards also if you have questions. You feel free to email me anytime after today's workshop. And there is an appendix at the end of the slides with links and information to some of the resources that I'll mention during the workshop. Before I get started, I just want to acknowledge what a challenging year this is. And I can't really talk about community investment without acknowledging what's going on at the federal level. Some of the advocacy tools I'm going to talk about may not be as effective as they were in prior years, but I do think of this period as a time to focus on learning, on gathering data, keeping track of what's going on so that we can tell the story of what's happening in the future. And also a time to focus on building relationships and finding allies. So I'll start and finish the workshop with some information on community organizing and how it informs a lot of the work that NCRC does that hopefully impact investment in communities. How many of you have heard of Midwest Academy? My colleague Justin has. Justin's a member of our organizing team. Midwest Academy is a great organization based in Chicago. They do, I think, 4 to 6 workshops a year called Organizing for Social Justice. I have a link to their resources page at the end of the slides. And they're a wonderful organization. I recommend everyone attend their organizing introductory workshop, whatever field you're in. If you never want to be an organizer, it's just a great way of thinking about building power and building relationships. So if you work in an organization, I think it's a valuable training to have, and even more valuable if you're interested in organizing and coalition building. So their definition of organizing really informs a lot of how NCRC approaches this work. It starts with building power, and that is a central idea behind community organizing. It's about empowering other people. For us, that means with data and information and connections to banks often that we partner with. So it's also about identifying the people and institutions like banks or governments or other anchor institutions in the community that have the power to make things happen and to make solutions possible. It does involve confrontation and pressure when collaboration and partnerships don't work. We, in our work with banks and community organizations, we try to facilitate connecting organizations with our bank partners as a first step, always through collaboration and partnership. But if that doesn't work, then we're always ready to use more confrontational tactics and pressure to accomplish community investment and fair and equitable lending. And then ultimately, the idea and goal of community organizing is that you've built a coalition or an institution that is democratically controlled and self-sustaining. So you'll also, if you take the Midwest Academy training, you will hear a lot about burnout and how to avoid it. And the dichotomy of control is a part of Stoic philosophy that an organizer taught me about. And I put in a few slides about this today because it's been very helpful to me this year as I watch the news to just constantly think about Stoicism and its relevance today. So the whole idea behind dichotomy of control to avoid burnout is to focus on what is in your control and not what's outside your control. The goal is to be able to navigate life with greater clarity and resilience. And in addition to trying to help resilience, it can also help inform strategy. So once you've identified what you can control, you can plan campaigns better and strategize and decide where to put your energy and what actions to focus on. NCRC actually had a summit last week in Nashville, and there was one panelist who didn't know it, but he's a Stoic philosopher. And this is something one of the panelists last week said is we need to be brutally honest with ourselves about what we're facing and about what we can and can't control, and then focus on what we can control. So this is like clearly a Stoic philosopher. But if you start listening for the idea of Stoicism and the dichotomy of control, you'll hear it everywhere. And when attending events like this, it's also helpful for me to listen for actions and things that are within my power when there is a lot of external stuff going on to worry about. Okay, on to redlining, and I didn't, sorry. One moment, I didn't hit my timer. Okay. So redlining, who's heard of redlining here? Okay, good. Most people have heard of redlining. Having a conversation about community investment really requires some foundational understanding of redlining and how it led to the Community Reinvestment Act. This is a redlining map of Portland, and if you are familiar with Portland, you can probably see communities that are red on this map that still may be underinvested and economically struggling. And that's the case throughout the country, where the Homeowner Loan Corporation created these redlining maps in the 1930s, and they have had a lasting impact on communities and families today. So redlining, to define it, was a decades-long practice that was started by the federal government and also became part of private sector lending, of refusing to make loans to certain communities that were deemed risky based on class, race, or immigrant status. So that led to decades of disinvestment, and one statistic that really stands out to me is from the 1930s until the 1960s, 1% of mortgage loans went to Black borrowers. So you can imagine the generational impact that that has had both on Black families and on the white families who were getting the other 99% of the loans. So in the 1970s, Congress enacted the Community Reinvestment Act. It was one of 4 civil rights laws, and it was expressly aimed at ending redlining and housing discrimination. The first of the civil rights laws enacted in the 60s and 70s was the Fair Housing Act that prohibits discrimination in housing. Then Congress enacted the Equal Credit Opportunity Act in 1974, which prohibits discrimination in lending. In 1975, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, or HMDA, was enacted, and this requires banks every year to disclose very detailed data on the ethnicity and race of their mortgage applicants and borrowers. And HMDA data is really at the foundation of a lot of the research and work that we do at NCRC, and informs how we work with banks, and a lot of our advocacy is based on lending analysis using this data. And the CRA was enacted in 1977. It's the only of those laws that has an affirmative obligation. It requires banks serve the entire communities in the markets where they're located. It is a colorblind law, even though it was enacted as an anti-redlining law. The metric in the statute is income. So CRA exams and CRA is all centered around census tract income and borrower income, which is a gap that we had hoped was going to be filled, but that's in the future. Hasn't happened yet. So since 1977, if you can believe it, when the CRA was initially passed, it wasn't required that the regulators publish CRA ratings or performance evaluations, so it was all hidden, and in 1989 that changed, and Congress enacted a law that required the publication of CRA ratings and CRA performance evaluations, which increases transparency and lets groups like NCRC and you all see how banks are doing. And then in 1995, a new regulation was passed, which is still in effect today, that defines how how banks are evaluated for CRA compliance. This is our NCRC's founder, John Taylor, and I like this quote because it just kind of summarizes what CRA is all about and how it connects to community and community organizing. He said the bank doesn't decide credit needs of a community, the community decides what its credit needs are. And that idea is at the foundation of some of the processes that I'll talk about later on in the workshop. So unfortunately, redlining is not a thing of the past. The DOJ in 2021 announced a combating redlining initiative. There have been almost 20 consent orders for redlining in the past 10 or 15 years. And there are numerous studies I'm happy to share afterwards if you're interested on the ongoing impact of redlining on communities, including health and other factors that communities that were redlined have yet to recover from. So reinvestment is very critical for those areas. Since being enacted in 1977, the CRA has resulted in more than $6 trillion of investments in LMI communities. It's hard to quantify CRA, whether it's a success or not. There are a lot of critics of CRA who claim that it, for example, led to the Great Recession, which has been debunked. That is not accurate at all. There are more and more studies coming out showing, for example, that CRA results in increased small business lending, which then in turn creates more employment in minority neighborhoods. One study showed that CRA led to one study showed that when a census tract loses its designation as low or moderate income, it then leads to a decline in mortgage lending during the first few years after the change in tract status. So CRA does direct dollars to the most underserved communities that need investment. And we're also working on a study that we haven't finalized, but I'll give you a preview. What we're seeing is that banks that do lending in states where they don't have branches, because CRA is based on where banks have physical locations, the lending that banks do in areas where they have physical locations and CRA obligations is much more evenly distributed than lending that banks do electronically in geographies where they have no physical presence. So that's just another indication that CRA works, and it's strongest when groups like you all pay attention and collaborate with banks. So that's, we're almost at the collaboration part, but I want to give a brief overview of the CRA rule. This is the 1995 rule that was enacted and implemented in 95. And NCRC and multiple organizations over the years have been trying to push for CRA reform, and there have been fits and starts. Finally, in 2023, the agencies did finalize a new rule that was aimed at increasing the impact of CRA. And unfortunately, this year, that rule was canceled, for lack of a better word. But we're back to the 1995 rule, which banks are familiar with and which has been around. So before going into details on the rule, I wanted to go back to some basic assumptions of CRA that are really essential to CRA's effectiveness. First, its presence in the community. CRA assumes that banks are physically present in communities via branches, ATMs, and loan production offices. And what we've seen recently in the last 15, 20 years is more and more digital banking, more and more bank mergers, and so that does impact the effectiveness of CRA. And CRA is also based on a deposit-based reinvestment model, which assumes that there's a traditional banking model going on where banks take deposits from the community and reinvest those dollars. I'll talk more about the industry and some shifts that are happening, but these are just some kind of unspoken assumptions in CRA that have really shifted lately and are making CRA less effective, and just that underscores the need to modernize CRA to reflect the current status of the banking industry. But back to the 1995 regulation, CRA is enforced by one of 3 federal regulators through an exam that takes place every 3 to 4 years. The regulators are the FDIC, who oversee state-chartered banks. The Federal Reserve regulates bank holding companies and some state-chartered banks. And then the OCC regulates national banks. This is the first tool I use when trying to research a bank. It's the FDIC's Bank Find Suite. It has tons of information. It's a great resource. And I have a little bank research guide at the end of the slides for you all if you're interested. I have a handout that I can email to anyone who would like to start researching banks. But essentially, if you want to start dialoguing and partnering with banks, it's very helpful to have just a basic understanding of how to find information on the banks that you want to talk to. So this is a great place to start. Any bank that has deposit insurance, which is practically all banks, no matter who their primary regulator is, they're going to be on this FDIC website. So once you've identified a primary regulator, you can go to that regulator's website and download CRA exams, which are technically called performance evaluations. The regulators publish a quarterly CRA exam schedule, and the CRA exam is a great opportunity for public participation in CRA and the CRA process. You can comment, you can send a comment letter to regulators anytime, but during the CRA exam is probably one of the best times to comment on bank performance in your community, and examiners have to consider public comments when they're doing an exam. So this is one way that public participation is built into the CRA evaluation process. The exams look at, this is an example of the Federal Reserve's upcoming exam schedule. You can click on the Fed location and then get a list of banks that are having an exam in the upcoming quarters. Exams look at how well banks are lending to low and moderate income borrowers and neighborhoods. They look at the level of support banks are putting into community development projects and branch distribution in LMI neighborhoods. Just a side note, there are multiple different evaluation methods. CRA isn't a one-size-fits-all type of test or exam. However, most banks that we work with fall under the large bank evaluation model. There are almost 1,000 banks that fit that description. The asset size is 1.6 billion for large banks right now, and so almost a quarter of banks fall under that description. And that asset size threshold is updated annually. Currently, it's 1.6 billion. So there are 4 CRA ratings that a bank can receive. It's basically a pass-fail test. The outstanding or satisfactory ratings are passing ratings, and needs to improve or substantial noncompliance are failing ratings. And when a bank fails a CRA exam, it does have consequences. It's more difficult for the bank to merge. It's harder for the bank to acquire new branches. And sometimes the bank has to face more frequent CRA exams, which is a big punishment in and of itself, just to have more frequent exams. We have called for more than 4 ratings to give a little more nuance to the system, but this is what we have under the 95 rule for now. And the vast majority of banks get a passing rating, 98% in the past, 10 years or more. 98% of CRA ratings are outstanding or satisfactory. So there's a little, feels like a little grade inflation. It feels like if you're in a class and you know that 98% of the people in the class are going to get an A on the exam. I don't know about you, but I would tend to work a little bit less hard at studying. So we also hope that in the future, in addition to more nuanced ratings, there will be maybe stricter evaluation of banks. But for now, the vast majority of CRA exams result in a passing grade. So the performance evaluation looks at 3 areas. They're called 3-component tests. The lending test accounts for 50% of the overall rating, and that looks at mortgage lending, small business lending, consumer lending, community development lending. Then there's an investment test that looks at investments like low-income housing tax credit investments. Philanthropy could fall under that category. And most banks that we've worked with, almost all of them have a foundation or philanthropy program, even though it's not required. And then the services test is 25% of the exam, and that looks at branch distribution, sometimes retail financial services, and how those deposit products are serving the community. And bank volunteerism is part of this, the services test. So banks often have people serve on boards, and they get CRA credit for that. And then again, examiners will consider, they'll look at public data, and they'll look at bank records as well as public comments. So again, it's important for the public to participate and submit comment letters telling the regulators how banks are doing in your community. So going back to one of the assumptions of CRA, which is that banks have facilities, CRA, because it was enacted in 1977, before there was any digital banking, it's all really centered on branch locations and office locations. And banks build what they call assessment areas, and those are the geographic areas around offices that will be where banks' performance is examined. So an assessment area, again, it's a geographic area around where banks have physical locations. It includes surrounding geographies near those locations where banks make loans, and they're typically a metropolitan statistical area or a continuous political subdivision like a county or a city. Assessment areas cannot arbitrarily exclude LMI neighborhoods, so banks can't gerrymander the geography that they want to be assessed in. And so this is really an antiquated piece of CRA that needs to be updated. There's one example I like to use about why this is something that we need modernization for. Square Financial Services. Have you all heard of Square? It's the company that small businesses use to take payments. They have a bank that is headquartered in Utah. They do small business lending nationwide, but their only assessment area for CRA purposes is in and around Salt Lake City. So they do 1% of their lending in Salt Lake City, and 100% of their CRA obligation is in that geography. So the other 99% of communities that are where they have activity are not getting any CRA reinvestment from in that case. So again, this is the rule we have and what we're stuck with, but definitely needs to be modernized to account for digital banking. A little bit more about the 3 different tests. Lending, again, looks at how well the bank is serving the credit needs of the community in 4 main areas: mortgage, small business, consumer lending, and community development. And again, it's focused on whether the bank's lending is reaching low to moderate income borrowers and neighborhoods. And this accounts for 50% of the CRA evaluation. The investment test looks at bank investments that have a community development purpose. Again, tax credit investments count. Banks get extra credit for complex, innovative community development investments. And banks that are above, I think it's 1.4 billion in assets. So again, I think that's about a quarter of banks that are out there are required to do community development, either lending or investment. And the services test evaluates retail banking services, branch distribution, and whether the bank has branches in low and moderate income geographies versus just putting their branches in upper and middle income census tracts. It includes bank volunteer hours and looks at how retail services are meeting the needs of the community. So a couple of research shortcuts. One is the FFIEC CRA rating search. This is the Federal Financial Institution Exam Council. They are a body composed of all the main financial institution regulators, and they have this website, which I have a link to in the slides, where you can look up, based on year, all the banks that passed or failed a CRA exam. So it's a really good way to find banks in your community that may be behind in CRA and may need some advocacy or partnership to encourage improvement. The CRA public file is a file that has been part of CRA regulations for a long time, but only recently have banks started to put them on their websites. So whenever I'm looking into a bank and its performance, I look at their website and see if I can find their public file. It includes the latest CRA exam. It'll list branch locations. They also will include a list of branch openings and closures, so you can see, and including census tract information. So you can see how many branches are in LMI census tracts versus middle and upper income tracts. And that transparency, I think, is very impactful, because I think banks are very sensitive to maintaining at least a certain percentage of their branches in LMI communities. They know that this information is in their public file, so it's public, and typically, when banks know they're being monitored and transparency is required, they do better. And so the CRA, I do think, has a really positive impact on ensuring at least some LMI branches remain. The public file also includes assessment area maps, so you can see where banks have reinvestment obligations. It will have small business and mortgage data, and then any public comments received in the past 2 years have to be posted on the CRA public file. So that's a great place to start if you're interested in learning more about CRA, and it would be in each individual bank's website. So again, I'll blame the regulators in this case. CRA performance evaluations almost always result in a passing grade. So there is a big need for more nuance in the ratings, but also advocacy from the community. So that's where you all come in. And I want to pause briefly. I think that was a lot of kind of technical information. Did anyone have any questions before I move on? So this is Gail Sincata, and she is known as the mother of CRA. She led the fight in the 70s for not just CRA, but the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. And in that fight, she understood and emphasized that CRA enforcement needed to involve communities and public participation. There are actually some great videos of her giving testimony before Congress that are really easy to find online if you're interested. She said the full responsibility for CRA enforcement has always been the job of people in the neighborhoods. And that's probably true now more than ever. So why get involved in CRA advocacy? It can improve bank performance, especially if they're not serving all members of the community. And that means increased resources for community development, more resources in underserved neighborhoods, and lasting partnerships between community organizations and financial institutions. What CRA advocacy means is the how of CRA advocacy is through comment letters on mergers, CRA exams, and partnering with banks to develop community benefits plans. So mergers are really a great opportunity to engage and partner with banks. And merger comment letters are are one of the key tools that the public has to get banks to pay attention and improve performance. When they're going under a merger review process, banks are required to show that the merger will benefit the public. And one way to do so is through a community benefits plan in partnership with local or national coalitions. And again, CRA exams are another opportunity for comment letters. So these are the three main tools we have in our toolbox for CRA advocacy. Yes.
Since we're recording. So I often hear about when banks are going to be merging, but I never hear about when it's time to, submit letters and how to do that. And so, like recently, there's been a big merger here in Oregon, and Umpqua Bank is now going to be Columbia Bank, I believe. And I was hearing all about that, but then I never knew that you could submit letters or do any of this investigation. So how do they publicize that, or is that just something that we need to know from hearing it from you and then do that investigation when we start learning of the merger?
We have someone here from Columbia, but and that was a name change, right? It was. Yes. So Umpqua changed their name to Columbia. But there also was a merger just approved, right?
Yes.
Um,
And yeah, there's announcements in newspapers and through other ways. It's not the most in my experience. It's not the easiest to your point to submit comments. To Catherine's point, I think part of what would have been nice with CRA modernization is updating some of the more archaic processes out there. But I mean, there are absolutely ways that you can submit comments, working, as Catherine noted, like with her organization, NCRC, or Casa of Oregon, more locally. These organizations a lot of times have direct lines to the bankers responsible for taking in that community input and either coming up with a community benefit plan or something else of that nature, and really listening to the feedback. So I think my probably number one piece of advice would be to work with these really impactful community organizations that you're hearing and aware of, and to help get that feedback to those bankers. Does that make sense?
I will add, in addition to there being an somewhat antiquated notice requirement, which does require newspaper notice, the regulators will post the comment period on their websites. So when we try to track merger activity, so the first thing you'll hear about is the press release. That's the bank's press release that goes online is the first notice we usually get that there's a merger coming up. And then we start monitoring the regulators' websites for the comment period. After the press release, there's usually a merger application that gets filed within a week or two or 3 weeks. Then the regulators, after another few days or a week, will post a comment period. And the comment period is 30 days, which is very short. By the time it's posted, it could be that there's only 3 weeks left. So as soon as we hear or see in the news a press release announcement, we kind of assume that the comment period is going to be within 4 to 5 weeks of that announcement. And that's when we would start kind of doing research and thinking about submitting a comment. So that's probably the the bank's own press release is probably the best way to watch merger activity. I'm not endorsing it, but there is a website called the Bank Slate, and it really does a good job of aggregating news and press releases on merger announcements. Was there another question?
I'm just writing down the bank slate.
Okay. So if you go to that website and search for the word buy, B-U-Y, it'll list all the recent merger announcements.
Thank you. Okay. So I have a question about the limits of comment letters as an advocacy or organizing tool in the context of a like rapid deregulatory landscape that is not in the benefit of low-income communities.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you anticipate any trends towards like ignoring comment letters or public comment, and understanding that this comes out of a movement.
Mm-hmm.
Like, are you seeing people starting to move again, like organize again at the grassroots level to maintain the pressure outside of what's able to be accomplished with letter writing campaigns?
I do think comment letters will be less impactful in this current administration. But going back to something I said earlier, I think it's really important that monitoring and data continue right now, because and comment letters, once they're submitted, they're part of a public record. So I think they're really important for that reason. It's hard, and it's a lot of work, and it's hard to submit a comment letter kind of knowing it's not going to stop a merger. I don't know if I've ever seen a comment letter stop a merger. Maybe it would delay the merger. It really annoys banks. I don't want to speak for bankers, but I think it really annoys the banks because they have to respond, and usually they hire a law firm to respond. So they don't like that. It costs money. It could cause a delay. Even if none of that were true, I think it would be really important. I still think it's important to submit letters to create a public record of how the banks are doing and what's happening in communities. Banks do perform better when there's transparency like that, and when they know that they're being monitored.
Yeah, my question or comment is, what if maybe you're not looking at submitting a comment letter that says something bad about the bank, but you are looking at establishing stronger partnerships with stronger financial support? Do you have any recommendations on how to do that?
I do. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So those two questions really do lead to the next part of my presentation, which is about partnerships. At NCRC, we use organizing to build coalitions and facilitate community benefits agreements between coalitions and banks. So this is another definition of organizing that looks at organizing again as a form of empowering people by building leaders, and that's kind of at the root of the community benefits agreements process and NCRC's process. So building coalitions involves building relationships and connecting with allies in your community. Oregon has a very, very strong reinvestment coalition, and they have come together, I know, to meet with Columbia Bank and other banks. It involves leadership development And again, building a constituency that has the information and the data and the tools and the power to have a strong dialogue with banks and connect with banks and build relationships. Two different approaches to organizing. One is the coalition building approach and consensus organizing that looks at mutual self-interest, common goals and outcomes. For example, advocating for creating a housing trust fund to support affordable housing. So this is all pretty abstract, but I'm happy to talk in more detail about the way coalitions can really empower community voices to have a seat at the table with banks. At NCRC, we, as a national coalition, did you have a question?
More, if it's all right, or just
Yeah.
a statement. My experience with working with coalitions and folks who are looking to organize is that it absolutely, like, in my opinion, in my experience, does make a difference. It may not always make the difference exactly that you want to see, but to Catherine's point, I mean, the banks that I work with, when different community members voice their feedback or just different things that they're having trouble with either that bank or banks in general, I think, yeah, again, everything that I've been part of over the years and just the work that I've gotten the chance to do, we hear those comments and we try to do our best to respond. Again, it's not always perfect, but like I do think we see a variety of things where we'll hear what the community is saying. Like, for instance, these bank on the nationally certified accounts. What we were hearing is that people wanted banks to offer accounts where there was not as many overdraft fees or no overdraft fees, or that were made more sense for especially customers who may not, who are just starting out. And I just, those are the things that, like, I think, like, the bank I've been part of, we heard that and we looked to put out an account that made more sense for a lot of the folks that I think work with a lot of the community partners here. And so, it's, in my opinion, it does matter.
Thank you. And it's really a marathon. So it's about building relationships, learning about banks so you can sort of understand how to speak to bankers, having some just basic vocabulary and comfort level to go into a meeting with banks and communicate what the community credit needs are, how the bank is doing in the community, or if they're not doing well, if there's a bank branch in your community, but you never see anyone from that bank, they don't have a presence, they're not building trust with the community. So those kinds of things are good information to share. And so ultimately, having a local coalition is something, my dream is that there are CRA coalitions, really strong coalitions that take up the work of negotiating and advocating for community benefits plans with banks in their market. And these agreements or plans are a public commitment or agreement between a bank and community groups, facilitated by either NCRC or a local CRA coalition, where the bank makes a public commitment to increase CRA activity. And they're often prompted by a merger. That's the most common motivating event that prompts a bank to work with NCRC. There have been cases in the past where a redlining settlement or a fair lending lawsuit has prompted a bank to want to improve and come and work with us on developing a plan. And the process always starts with listening sessions, which are organized by either NCRC or a CRA coalition, where community leaders meet with bank executives to tell them what the community's credit needs are. The CBA goals are really based on CRA evaluations. So, and the goal of a CBA or a community benefits plan is to increase investment. So not just continue doing what the bank's been doing, but look at their level of lending over the past 3 to 5 years and commit to a certain percentage increase to increase loans to underserved borrowers and communities in mortgage and small business lending, a higher level of community development loans and investments. Branches are very important, so it's a tough thing to get banks to agree to do, but we're always looking for commitments for increased branch presence in low and moderate income communities. Philanthropy, we ask for increases to support especially BIPOC-led groups, and also to track that, where their philanthropy is going. We always ask for disclosures on staff and supplier diversity, which was not easy to get in the past. It's harder to get banks to openly, publicly commit to that now, but we'll keep asking. The process of developing a CBA or a community benefits plan starts with an analysis of bank performance, and that's why I went into some details on bank research and how to find CRA exams. We look for gaps in services and areas, either geographic markets or loan products, where the bank is behind its peers and needs improvement, and use that to propose areas where the bank should focus its plan. The organizing team at NCRC will identify local leaders to meet with the bank. They will facilitate listening sessions with members and allies, and those listening sessions are really the experts in the community telling the bank what the communities need. So we take every single recommendation that comes out of those meetings and put it in a proposal to the bank, and then the bank develops the plan. Ideally, it's incorporating some of the ideas and insights from the listening sessions. Each of the plans that NCRC has developed, and a lot of banks that haven't partnered with us, do have a community advisory board or an advisory council which meets regularly, and that's usually a board of 10 to 15 community leaders who meet with the bank 2 to 4 times a year to look at progress towards the goals. And the idea behind the advisory council is to bring community leaders to the table with the bank, and where the bank potentially is behind in its progress, or if there are markets or products that aren't reaching the goals that the bank had set for themselves. The idea is to have ideas and insights from the community to help figure out how they can improve performance. This is a timeline of a typical community benefits plan development. This is actually the one that NCRC did 5 years ago with Columbia Bank. I can't believe it's been that long. But again, the whole process starts when we hear a merger announcement or see it in the news. Then we'll reach out to the bank to get their buy-in into the community benefits plan process, and hopefully local coalitions will start doing the same thing. If there's a regional merger or smaller merger in your community, finding relationships with someone at the bank to connect with them, to encourage the community benefits plan process, be a part of their merger, is the first step. And then the listening sessions take place, followed by negotiating and finalizing a plan which has both quantitative goals and qualitative commitments to the communities and the bank's footprint. And then the plan is announced, the merger gets approved, and then the process of monitoring and ongoing engagement with the bank begins. Any questions? I have one more brief section with some closing thoughts. We do have tools and resources available. We have templates, and I'm very happy to share that kind of information with anyone who's interested in learning more about the process or researching a bank, or even if you have a meeting with a bank and you need help preparing, we're happy to help with that. So some closing thoughts. Again, I really think a lot about how the banking industry is shifting, and the more digital banking we have, the more people are using fintechs to hold their money instead of depositing money with banks. All of that is chipping away at CRA's impact. So I really feel strongly that banks are important allies, especially right now. The more banks we have, the stronger our banks, the more CRA reinvestment we have. This is some data on bank consolidation, and this is another thing that's changing fundamentally how CRA works. We have fewer banks and fewer branches. In 2015, there were almost 81,000 bank branches, and last year that number went down to 68,000. So that underscores the need for CRA modernization, but it also underscores the need for more CRA advocacy, because fewer bank branches means fewer reinvestment obligations. Another thing that's changing in the industry is mortgage lending has decreased significantly for all lenders. This is a chart showing the decline in mortgage lending over the past few years, largely due to interest rates and probably the cost, as you know, the cost of housing and housing supply is just making mortgage lending very challenging for all lenders. And the banking sector has a smaller share of the mortgage market, which is largely now controlled by non-bank mortgage companies that have no CRA obligation. So what are we supposed to do? I think going back to community organizing and the Midwest Academy, I think building relationships right now is really critical to civic engagement and resilience for the next few years. So one thing they talk about at Midwest Academy, which is kind of an action step I wanted to end with today, is the one-on-one meeting, which is really foundational to organizing, and it involves just having conversations coffee or lunch with people in your community. I encourage you all to ask bankers for one-on-one meetings, and find out what motivates them. Find out what their individual motivation is, what their individual interests are, but also what motivates the bank. What's the bank's priority? So I think I'm going to end with that, and we have a little bit of time for questions if anyone has any.
I just want to make a couple comments. I'm Peter Hanley, Executive Director of CASA of Oregon, and I'm on the NCRC board, and have participated in a number of meetings with banks outside of doing community benefits agreements, mostly to sit down with them and talk about what it looks like to show up in community. And, you know, I think those types of meetings are really good. Obviously, when you're going in at the time of a merger, things are a little more heightened. And so if you can just establish some regular rapport with your local banks, that oftentimes goes a long way to them really, you know, putting in place the things that you want to see happen in your community. We worked on, when I say we, I think of you know, the much broader community of Housing Oregon and its members. You know, worked on community benefits agreements for 3 mergers, Columbia and the Umpqua Bank being one, BMO and Bank of the West, and then U.S. Bank merged with Union Bank down in California. They had a presence here in Oregon, but really the impact was, you know, more felt down in California. So a lot of the stuff in the community benefits agreement was really geared towards the California market. But it's important that, you know, folks have that opportunity to show up and speak. Like Catherine was saying, you can put a letter in a bank's file anytime, but really those ongoing conversations, taking those opportunities when their exam is coming up, to put a comment in. And sometimes the examiner will even call folks if you do work in the community and they know that a bank and your organization works with them. They'll call to ask you some questions. So I just encourage folks to engage the banks outside of maybe any of those regular things that would be happening, like a merger or their exam, just to let folks know exactly who you are and what kind of work you're doing in the community.
Hi, good afternoon. Juan Campos, Director of Home Pathways on Gresham, Oregon. So CRA only affects banks. So today, 3/4 of mortgage lendings happens in independent mortgage bankers or mortgage companies. So what is happening to hold them accountable to CRA and putting them on the same level of banks?
I
Now,
think
how do we hold them accountable to philanthropy
to
obligations?
fair lending and
Fair lending.
I mean, so they're not, independent mortgage companies are not subject to CRA. They don't have CRA obligations. They are subject to the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act. So research and data analysis is critical. Monitoring their performance is really important. We do have a research team that puts out a mortgage market report every year, and they've just published 4 of a 7-part series looking at mortgage data. So there are groups like NCRC that are examining how those mortgage companies are doing. And there are states with state-level CRA statutes. I think in terms of advocacy, the state CRA landscape will be really important in the coming years, and a lot of groups are advocating for state CRA to cover independent mortgage companies. I think that is the case in maybe a handful of states. There are CRA bills in progress in California and New Jersey. But that's one thing that we can work on when we kind of know that we're not going to get a new federal statute enacted that is something we want in the short term. Well, thank you all. Thank you all for being here. My card is here, and again, the slides will be available, and I'm happy to answer any questions anytime today or after today.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad I was in your session. I learned a lot, so I really appreciate it. It's kind of dense. It's like a lot of overlap in the work that I do. It's so interesting to hear about like the side of it. We're like really focused on like rental and like discrimination, but like I was always curious about those CRA funds, especially as like a nonprofit, like trying to like raise money in light of like federal cuts. And what we're seeing is like fair housing isn't really like something that's funded through CRAs, but fair housing activities usually isn't. There's like other things that are more like like kind of requirements for them to use those funds for, but still it's like it's really important for affordable housing. So thank you. It's nice meeting you.
Nice to meet you.
Hi. Thanks, Kareem.
Nice to meet you.
You too as well. So I wasn't sure if this was all going to be over my head. I work in a nonprofit architecture and community organizing practice, which is why I was interested in like the organizing angle. We don't do a lot of housing design work, but we do organize with folks who are in coalition around housing justice. I'm curious, most of my coworkers are based in New Orleans. There's some of us here in Portland.
Okay.
The landscape is quite different in each region, so they're dealing with a much more hostile environment. I mean, like politically, legislatively.
I live in North Carolina. Like when I come to the Northwest, I'm so jealous of your state government.
I mean, every place has
I know it's not,
stuff,
yeah, everywhere.
but yes, for sure. Well, so I am curious, like, if there's any resources you would direct folks towards, like, with like my coworkers and folks that they're involved with doing housing justice work in Louisiana.
I don't really have a big network in Louisiana. I will say, like, the migration patterns of people just moving geographically. People are moving to the south. I don't understand why, because it's hot and humid and it's getting hotter. But bank merger activity is also very active in the south. So I would say, like, keep your eyes on bank mergers impacting Louisiana, because it's always a good time to engage. And I'm very happy to talk to anyone. Like, we have sample comment letters. We can pull research for groups if they want to comment on the merger. We do have relationships with a lot of banks, and I love connecting community groups with banks. So I would say watch the bank slate for mergers impacting Southeast, and be ready to engage. Call us, we'll give you whatever forms you need.
And you think bank mergers as the opportunity to advocate for community benefit agreements is like the best avenue to approach?
It's a good time to advocate for a CBA, but even when mergers aren't happening, you can always request meetings with banks, and I think a lot of CRA and banking is about relationships. So that's
It's a whole marathon.